Hello and welcome to everyone. Just give people a few more seconds to arrive. This has clearly been a very popular topic, and hopefully people have lots to say about it as well, because we want to hear from you in terms of what your experience has been. So we'll just give it a sec. Right. Okay. Let's forge ahead, and people can catch up if they're as we go. So hello and welcome to everyone. Welcome to July's tea break. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight here at the Audience Agency. And for purposes of description, I'm a white male wearing a black t-shirt with blonde-ish hair. They couldn't really tell in this gloom, with a background with loads of postcards. And I am joined by my colleague, Catherine Bradley, one of our senior consultants. And over to you, Catherine, for a quick hello and intro.
Hello, everybody. Great to see so many people here. Just for the purposes of the recording, I'm a white female with a black t-shirt, glasses, and long fair hair.
Oh, there you are. But black t-shirts aren't a uniform,
yeah.
But it just seems we've defaulted to them. And you may see us cheer in a second. We've hit 99, 100% participants. There we are. So we've hit 3 figures. So yes, thank you all for coming along. So today's session, we're going to be talking about school trips, in particular, some things about school trips in general and sort of background to some of those trends, about a particular tool that we think might be helpful in understanding schools and school profiles. And then finally, a particular case study in relation to that. Catherine's going to give us a little bit of a response, and hopefully you've all got lots of things to say, ask, share afterwards as well. So, where to start? When I said that I was doing this session yesterday, I said to my wife, I'm doing a session tomorrow talking about school trips. And she's a teacher, and I wish I could capture the particular tone of incredulity with which she said, but what do you know about school trips? So hands up, I'm not an expert on school trips, but here's a whole load of stuff which hopefully will be useful. And I imagine lots of you are experts on school trips, so hopefully we can share that. However, I have been hearing quite a lot about school trips recently, particularly through the work we've been doing with Arts Council touring, looking at performing arts organisations and some of the key trends that are going on behind touring. And some of you who are kind of regular tea breakers will have seen, if it will let me advance the slide, this chart from a couple of sessions ago, where we looked at the change in the number of tickets for different sizes of transaction, so single tickets, 2 tickets, 3 tickets, etc. And essentially what this was showing was that compared to pre-pandemic, all of the sizes that were below what you might call groups were back up to previous levels, but all the ones that were kind of 7 tickets and above, and particularly 12 and above, were, or more than 12, were down. So it's this block is the kind of a really key sort of missing audience since pandemic. And we know from talking to people and various work we've done that a lot of that is about schools audiences not having returned. So that sort of, I guess, was a prompt to explore it further. And again, at last month's session, people said they really wanted to talk about schools more. So hopefully that is what's going to happen. So just a little bit of background in relation to this. So I've done a little bit of delving around on secondary research, and the Sutton Trust have done a survey with school leaders, of which 50% of them had said that there were cuts to school trips happening that they were aware of, that had boosted considerably from the year before in 2022, and we know that trend has persisted. So we know there are fewer trips happening. But interestingly, they were seeing that particularly concentrated amongst schools in areas with greater deprivation. So in a way, the schools with the kids who arguably could benefit most from school trips are more likely to be missing out on them. So I think that's a kind of a notable thing to be conscious of. Other background, so I mentioned this Arts Council touring research we've been doing. And of course, we've heard from people that budget pressures are a key driver of some of the issues around school trips. School budgets are fascinatingly complicated, I've just discovered, when you're trying to delve into exactly how much money schools are or aren't getting and what for and how you calculate it and rate it per pupil. But the long and the short of it is that, yes, school budgets are clearly actually being squeezed, even if nominal amounts of money are going up. There is an interesting background trend that currently pupil numbers in schools are relatively high, but they're dropping. So the number of primary school pupils is dropping by about 1% a year. And then, understandably, for political reasons, in a few years' time, so about 3 or 4 years' time, secondary school pupil numbers will also then start dropping by sort of similar levels. I guess that's how aging works. But that's something to bear in mind, that there's a background trend where there's a kind of, drop in the number of pupils, albeit slow, but there is a drop coming. We've heard from people that it's not just about the money. It's also about all the practical stuff that goes around school trips. So it's the challenges of doing risk assessments. And even back a few years ago, when we produced a resource for to think about sort of schools audiences that we'll share as a link afterwards, we had flagged that being really transparent around things to include in a risk assessment can just make the whole process of organising trips much easier. But schools are increasingly concerned not only about their own budgets, but the budgets of pupils and their parents, which again has probably contributed to that greater squeeze among schools working in more deprived areas. There's more of an inclination not to organise a trip in case it incurs costs for parents who can't afford it. Of course, alongside that, there's the kind of curriculum changes, fewer people doing arts and sort of cultural subjects more broadly, but also that schools are being assessed on sort of the attainment 8 kind of core curriculum, and therefore things that boost other parts of the school offer but don't focus on that, again deprioritized by school leaderships. So again, that's something to be conscious of, and conscious of where cultural offers can actually impact on some of those sort of core bits of curriculum. So there's some really interesting conversations I've seen people having about the fact that there's much more maths available in heritage organisations and arts organisations offers than maybe we're immediately conscious of, but actually that could be a way of reaching into other bits of the curriculum. There's also been lots of talk about coaches have got more expensive, and I tried to find some actual hard evidence to back that up beyond a general sense that they're more expensive. And I found myself delving through the forums of the UK Coach Operators Association. So I did that so you don't have to. And looked at all the conversations they were having about changes in coach provision. And from their internal consultation with members, they were reporting, even a couple of years after the pandemic, about a 25% jump in costs. And that's persisted. But also they've started to note, so there's a conversation I found particularly interesting where they were talking about price competition and saying it used to be the case that if someone chose not to go with an operator because of cost, they'd go to the competitor down the road. Whereas now they're hearing people saying, oh, if that's the cost, then I just won't do the trip. And so it does appear to be, there's a very visible link between coach travel prices and people just not going, which could therefore mean that ways of avoiding the need for coach travel become quite important. And that could be about sort of touring content into schools as opposed to arranging school trips to come out of schools. That's something that Grimm & Co in Rotherham, that I'm on the board of, they've done a really interesting thing where they've kind of developed a kind of almost like a stage set that's kind of designed like the actual visitor attraction itself, but they can then take into schools and rebuild within a school and then hold sessions inside this kind of environment that they've created. So obviously there's an upfront cost to doing stuff like that, but once you've done it, it could maybe make it a lot easier for lots of different schools and schools in areas maybe where there's more pressure on budgets. So anyway, so that's some of the background context, just to say, we're seeing these are some of the drivers of what's causing changes to school trips. But there's a tool, a report that we've produced within the agency that, and I need to be really careful, I don't want this to sound super salesy because it's absolutely not, but it's one of the things that we've created where I've sort of assumed once it was made, it's like, that's going to be really helpful for loads of people. And then we haven't heard of loads of people using it. I mean, some have with success, and we'll talk about that, but it feels like one of those sort of slightly kind of hidden things. So I thought it might be useful to chat a bit about it and what it is and how you might be able to use it or might find it helpful. So it's a thing called the Schools Engagement Report, which is a relatively simple, I would say off the shelf, but there's a lot of conversation to set it up beforehand to make sure that we're giving you exactly what you need. But essentially it's a standardized, simple report that takes a whole load of different information from different sources and collates it into one place to allow a kind of profiling of school trips and school audiences. So what it does is it takes information from the organization, and that can be at different levels. It can be kind of overall, this is the schools we're engaging with, or it can be more granular, kind of, we had this many trips by year 9s, we had this many trips with year 8s, etc. So depending on the information you've got, it can kind of work at one level or the other. But essentially, you put some of your information in. It takes information from the school census. It takes information from various other secondary data sets about the sort of local population. It takes data from audience spectrum, which is our sort of profiling model, and it kind of collates them all together into a kind of summary report that shows who are you reaching, how does that compare to your designated local area that you want to compare to. So for example, it includes information about geography, it includes mapping, it includes number of pupils in different age groups, year groups, types of schools. Is it state-funded primary? Is it secondary? Is it independent? Is it academy? Actually, sorry, it doesn't include the private sector. It's worth mentioning that. Whether it's co-ed or just for girls, just for boys, or is it a religious school, and if so, which denomination, and a whole load of information about the kind of background group, as well as some things about the pupils and how this works. Does it cover Scotland? Yes, it does. There are 3 different versions of this, well, 3 different national versions. There's a Wales, Scotland, and England one, and each of them include mostly the same information, but with some differences. So the Scotland one, for example, uses Scottish indices of multiple deprivation quintiles, so fifths by deprivation, and whether people speak Gaelic. The Wales one includes Welsh speaking, and I think that's the biggest difference for Wales. And they draw on different census data, for example. And yes, you can use it for school tours. You'd have to think about who the base population was, but if you had like a wider area you're reaching, you could use that as a comparator and then look at the individual schools you'd reached, and then that would be a really good use of it, I think. So it includes all the information about the local area, the broad type of school, but also the profile of students within the school. And if you've provided information about the number of students per age group, etc., it kind of weights it by that, or but it weights it by the number of visits you have by different schools, and it does all those calculations for you behind the scenes. So you could say, for example, we're reaching this proportion of pupil premium students, and the background population has this proportion, or looking at the ethnic profile makeup of the schools and the local area, whether they have additional language needs, whether they're selective schools or non-selective schools, whether they do arts mark relative to other schools, and the audience spectrum profile. So that's our segmentation model that kind of summarizes the population. The audience spectrum profile of the schools that you're reaching, or the areas of the schools you're reaching relative to the background population. Obviously, there's an inference going on there because it's based on the household, not the individual pupil. But it's sort of saying these pupils are coming from these types of households based on where they are. So, for example, so you have the mapping that I just showed you just now, but for each of these different measures, and there's I can't remember exactly how many, but it's quite a few, like 15 different measures. There's a breakdown of which pupils are you reaching compared to the target area, and which schools are you reaching relative to schools in the target area. So you get to see those comparators. So, for example, in this case, you'd see that they we're reaching lots of community schools, relatively speaking, but not many academies. So they might look at that and say, okay, so which of the academy trusts in the local area, are there things that those academy trusts are prioritizing that we're not doing, or are there particular relationships we need to build, or what is it that makes that academy figure a little bit lower? Is that a deliberate policy? Is it is it maybe something that we want to increase? But it allows you to do that for lots of the other measures as well. So the other thing it lets you do is, if you analyze a set of schools, or and the pupils of those schools that you're currently reaching, you can then run the same report again in 12 months, in 3 years, whatever it is, and use one as a baseline for the other. So you can do a whole load of interventions and then see what impact it had on who you're reaching. So it's quite a good way of evidencing that kind of shift, but also having it done sort of independently by a third party to say, look, this is it, and this is what it was, this is what it's moved to, is again, it's just quite a useful way of getting kind of convincing information. So I was just going to talk through a particular instance of where this has been used, and in this instance also to talk about how it can be used combined with other things, because obviously a lot of this secondary data is very helpful, but it's a very particular type of information you're getting, and so it may be that you want to be able to combine it with other sources. So this is a project we've done with the National Slate Museum up in Northwest Wales. They're going through a really huge National Lottery Heritage Fund supported redevelopment program. That's like a £12 million program. So it's the biggest one in Wales, I think, going on currently. But this was one very particular bit of the much wider range of support that we gave them. So they were looking at a whole load of different audience groups. So this was just the kind of, okay, this is just the focus on schools. So although it's a big project, this bit of it's actually quite self-contained. It's a few days work. It's a off the shelf report. But it allowed them to answer some key questions about how to redevelop that offer as part of the redevelopment. So they're doing this big development. They want to look at how they develop their schools offer, particularly who are they reaching, who are they not reaching, what profile of people are they getting to, who's available in the catchment area in general, and what would they want to do differently in future. I should say, in terms of that, who's in the catchment area in general, the schools engagement report gives you that as part of that kind of baseline and the comparative figures. There is a version you can do if you don't have your own data. It's called a schools target report, if memory serves. It's very similar. It just obviously doesn't have your own data in as a comparator, and it costs slightly less. But that's what they're trying to find out. And so they used a combination of two things. So there's engagement report, which answered, you can see, like 4 out of 5 of those initial questions. Who are they reaching in different ways? And then we did a range of kind of workshops and interviews. And so we sort of took school groups to visit the site as it currently is and looked at how they interacted. So did a bit of observational research, but also did sort of one-to-one interviews alongside that. We will share links for these, yes, as part of the follow-up. I think the school's target report actually isn't currently online as a separate thing, but it's all the contact details the same, and it's just £75 less, I think. But we'll share a link to that afterwards. So yeah, we sort of did conversations with people as they're going around, and whilst also watching what people are doing. And so here's some of what they had in that summary report. I'm not going to go into all of it, but just looking at the mapping on the left, for example, you can see they set their target area as North Wales, and so that's who we're trying to reach, broadly speaking. But actually, who they were reaching was very heavily concentrated in the local area, in Gwynedd, a little bit less in Anglesey and Conway. But actually, once you get into a sort of like northeast Wales, they really weren't reaching that many schools, and that is also then partly reflected in them having a lower proportion of urban audiences, as you can see on the next slide. But you can also see, So yes, that's Megan just explaining. So you can also see that if you look at the different types of schools they're reaching, that they're, 2/3 of the schools they're reaching are primary. Well, in fact, sorry, 3/4 of the schools are reaching primary, but 2/3 of the pupils. So you obviously you've got more pupils coming from one than the other per visit. But there's a clear concentration in Key Stage 2, particularly Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, relative to the local school population. So again, that might highlight, actually, is there more we could be offering around Key Stage 4, around Key Stage 5 that might kind of boost that part of the mix? Or would we prefer to concentrate just on that group, in which case, that's obviously a valid choice as well. And similarly, they can look at, for example, the reach by language, because this is in Wales and therefore using the Welsh report. And again, you can see that actually they're really massively over-indexing on schools with Welsh language. So that's interesting. Indeed, a whole load of this research had to be done in Welsh, which is an interesting challenge, but we have Welsh speakers available to do that. And so I mentioned the rural-urban mix, but equally you can look at, are they reaching pupils with who are eligible for free school meals, and they're a bit under-indexed for that. So that might suggest there could be some things to explore about trying to broaden that reach. But they're over-indexed for those with additional learning or special educational needs. So that's kind of interesting as well. So they can see where they are now on those, and again, as they change things, then see how those evolve. And on the left, that's a summary, that's a list of the segments that we engage with. And you can see that they are skewed towards reaching certain segment groups rather than others based on their sort of target catchment area. And obviously, if that area was different, then that kind of comparator would shift as well. But they're getting quite a lot, particularly from these groups, dormitory dependables and trips and treats. So kind of what you call it, more called middle engaged groups, often with relatively high proportions of families, unsurprisingly, given school visits. But again, you can kind of look for particular groups, who you're reaching, what difference does it make in terms of who's coming. And then just briefly, to touch on some of the outputs from the more kind of qualitative or interactive research that we did with them. We heard that people really loved their existing resources, the pre-trip resources. And so that was something that was really working already. But when people were on site, they didn't necessarily know what they were and weren't allowed to engage with. And maybe that wasn't as clear as it could be. And that's something they might want to think about during the kind of redisplay, about kind of making it more obvious to people, particularly because when it was ambiguous, people were erring on the safe side and not engaging often. And so they were missing out on things they could engage with and or getting told off if they do engage things they shouldn't. But also there was a curiosity to kind of go behind the scenes and explore and kind of visit other bits of the museum, which might suggest there's actually an appetite for a type of content around that wasn't being explicitly served at the time. They were focusing on the content about the slate and the slate industry and the local heritage, as opposed to how do we go about communicating and sharing this. And in general, there was an appetite for kind of broadening a curriculum, like we talked about. And yes, I know Megan's comment, this is quite wordy, these slides, but you can read them back. And an appetite, and we've heard this in lots of different contexts, for school trips to supplement and provide something different to classroom teaching. So it's about experiences you can't have, or kind of interactivity you can't have, or a kind of immersiveness, or something that then prompts later things in the classroom, or kind of can act as a stimulus for a project, as opposed to being a kind of replacement for your kind of classic teaching. So focusing on how do they sort of enhance that aspect of the experience without that aspect of the experience being so intense that those pupils with particularly, for example, sensory needs or a tendency to be overstimulated, finding it therefore quite a difficult environment. So it's kind of how they sort of balance that or provide the opportunities for different ways of engaging depending on the particular children's needs. Which again, if you look back at the engagement report, you can see they're doing really well at engaging with children with special educational needs, and therefore that becomes particularly a prominent part of their audience. So two quite different types of research, but that sit with each other quite nicely in terms of kind of a broad here's the broad context and who you're reaching, and then also what that experience is like at the heart of it. So, in summary, before I pass over to Catherine in a second, to say, yes, we've seen school trips dropping. We can talk a little bit about what is sitting behind that and some of the kind of data and evidence that explains that. This particular report, the schools engagement report, could be a useful way of finding out some of the kind of background information that can inform or make the case for school engagement. And hopefully that one particular example in terms of the Slave Museum gives you a bit of a sense of a way that it can be used, or kind of seeing bits of it in more detail. Albeit, of course, there's lots more detail in the actual report, bar the few charts that I shared there just by illustration. So Catherine, yes, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I'll just share a few reflections really on both some of the information that's been presented, but also just on our experience a bit more widely of working with organisations around their school visits. So as already outlined, the overall picture of decreasing school trips is an additional challenge alongside others in the current climate, and one thing to be considered as part of a sort of wider audience development planning, really, and all the wider sort of challenges and opportunities that an organisation is facing. We know from working with cultural organisations that they tend to know really well many of the schools and the teachers that they engage with, and obviously that's due to things like the staff-led nature of school visits, workshops, that type of thing, and the kind of closer booking processes that are usually associated with them as well. And, you know, really, really fantastically, there's a depth of relationship there that's not often seen with general audiences. So something great to build on there, and more kind of intrinsic knowledge sometimes within the organisation. We found, working with organisations, that the school's engagement reports provide some really useful hard evidence of the reach that a school's programme is achieving. And in some cases, that data might not be surprising for education staff within an organisation, or on the other hand, it may actually challenge some assumptions around overall engagement. For example, there might be assumptions that are based on schools with which the organisation just has a very close relationship, but they might not be perhaps seeing the whole picture. So that gives a kind of hard evidence and the whole picture, which is really useful. One of the other things we find is that the reports often show that organisations are engaging much more diverse audiences through schools than seen in their audiences overall. So, for example, it's particularly common to see much more ethnic diversity within schools visits than it is within audiences overall. And also to see much more of the lower culturally engaged audience spectrum groups within school visitors as well. And just thinking about audience spectrum as well, the breakdown here gives a really useful picture of the likely cultural engagement levels that children have within their family unit too. So that might really affect their behaviours or attitudes when they visit a cultural organisation. So it gives insight there into what you might need to do to respond to that, and also to identify where there may be greater opportunities to engage families separately on the back of school visits, or where that's likely to be much more of a challenge. We have got links at the end, but there's a really wide range of resources to support audience spectrum. There's pen portraits, motivation guides, mapping, lots of resources. So in terms of kind of understanding the cultural behaviour of those groups, all the resources to do that are completely free to access on our website. So just thinking back about the uses really as well, beyond this of those engagement reports. I think one really important thing to say is that they can be a very powerful advocacy tool. They really demonstrate the value of school visits, and they really can really demonstrate where schools are reaching parts of the population that a general audience might not be. They're really insightful for planning as well. And I know we had a question about this earlier, but in terms of evaluation, and we use these a lot in evaluation, and particularly useful over kind of multi-year projects where we might produce sort of one per year and just keep a track of the types of schools that are being engaged, and think about how that might compare to the general audience as well. They can also really help, particularly because they include audience spectrum profiling, to join up audience development language and approaches that are used across both schools as well as general audiences. So to understand how those two audiences relate to each other using that tool particularly. And we always advocate a joined up approach across all areas of an organisation in audience development planning. And that obviously works in many different ways, but this is one kind of really strong way in which that kind of, there can be more joining up between schools and audiences overall. Just thinking aside to different types of research now, as the case study with the National Slate Museum has highlighted, gathering deeper feedback from schools can really help to understand their motivations for engaging with an organisation. And they might be vast, as I'm sure you're aware, and they might span sort of various different curriculum links. They might include social or special treat visits, for example. It can also help to understand what's working and what's not working for schools visits within your organisation, and also to establish where perhaps the best curriculum links can be made as well. We all know the challenges of collecting data from schools and teachers, and they are significant. So I thought it might be useful just to outline some of the things that we've seen work best in our work with organisations. So particularly we've seen that simple, quick or unintrusive methods during a visit can often work really well with schools. And that might include a really short paper survey for teachers, or perhaps for older children as well visiting. Things like simple questions posed to children as part of the actual activity. So we might ask them for sort of hands up feedback, 5-finger feedback, kind of smiley faces, that sort of thing. So quick and easy can be built into a session. And also observations, as we saw in the case study as well. So something that is not kind of taking up time from the teachers and the children themselves during that visit. We've also seen follow-up e-surveys can work really well where the relationship with the teacher is strong enough, but that isn't the case always. So it's kind of really about kind of understanding, I suppose, where that is the case, and then inviting that teacher to support your organisation by giving their feedback. And then for things like focus groups or interviews, so kind of deeper and follow-up research that might take place with schools, we found that incentivizing that's really important. So something like a voucher for wide use, or something like Amazon, something like that, that can be used quite widely is really helpful in order to encourage teachers to take part outside of a visit. That's all the reflections I had, but on the next slide, we've got some links through to our tools and resources. So hopefully those are useful for you. So I'll just pass back to Ollie now to run through those.
Yes, I'll keep it really brief because I want to get onto sort of hearing from other people as well. But thanks, Catherine. Appreciate that. So yes, this is really just to say, if you are interested in these, you can just have a conversation with someone about, would it be helpful? How might it be helpful? Do email either the answers at the audience agency in terms of the schools report or the schools target report, or hello at the audience agency in terms of any of the other things, the consultancy, support, workshops, etc. Although actually I think those both end up in the same place, but I use either email address, but also if you're interested in how you might combine with other things. But essentially we're here to help, so give us a shout, even if you just want a little bit of informal advice about, I'm thinking of doing this, do I need to ask this kind of thing, or do I have it or information already? Then just let us know.